You don't have to open the pacemaker, open the heart and readjust its parameters.
Correct.
So it has some remote access. But the same facility is utilized for hacking that pacemaker, and you can assassinate an individual. One ethical hacker, he demonstrated with one command, he can send an electrical shock of 400 volts to all of them at one go.
The bombs were carrying the insects.
Yes. So which insects were used? Fleas, mosquitoes, ticks. Dissecting a human when he is alive and without any anesthetic. You can imagine children, women, old people, anybody and everybody getting dissected like that in the name of research of bioweapon development.
Namaste and welcome to this episode of the Oddcast Show. The Second World War ended with a bang. Hiroshima and Nagasaki was bombed, but not Tokyo. Have you ever wondered why? Have you ever thought that there could be more potent weapons than nuclear weapons? To discuss this, we are joined by Dr. Mrinmayee Bhushan, who is a policy analyst in biochemical warfare. Namaste, ma'am. Welcome to our podcast.
Namaste.
Thank you so much for coming here. And I would love for you to start us off with some knowledge on a movie called Prometheus. There's a very common quote on it that humans are the only stupid ones to construct weapons of mass destruction and biochemical warfare on their own home planet. Can you please give us some perspective on that and what exactly are weapons of mass destruction and biochemical warfare?
I'm so happy that you invited me on this podcast to start with. To answer your question, the weapons of mass destruction are basically targeted at large number of people, as the word tells you. And typically there are three categories of weapons which are categorized in weapons of mass destruction. It is nuclear, biological and chemical. They're called as NBC weapons, right? All the glamour is always taken by the nuclear. So nobody really talks about biochemical weapons, So let's focus more on biochemical weapons and rather no mention of nuclear weapons, so to say. So when we talk about biochemical weapons, what are biochemical weapons? Chemical weapons are chemicals, typically which are toxic to humans. And biological weapons are slightly a different category, so to say. Biological weapons, when somebody wants to develop biological weapons, they use biological agents and some delivery mechanism. Why? So, because the biological agents are bacteria, viruses, and toxins. Put it very simply, right? But they're very fragile. How do you weaponize them? So you have to have some delivery mechanism. So if these agents are just released in the air, they will get destroyed by the natural environment as such, sunlight and temperature, and there are just so many other factors which will destroy these agents as such. So you have to have some delivery mechanism. And for development of these delivery mechanisms, very innovative ideas have been developed over the years. This is a very long history of biological and chemical weapons. It's almost 100-year-old history. We barely talk about it, but it is almost 100-year-old history since even before the World War I. In fact, World War I was the one in which chemical weapons were used extensively, though our history books barely talk about it. But the chemical weapons were extensively used in First World War. And Second World War also saw the explosion of chemical and biological warfare.
But ma'am, we have never heard about this while reading about stuff in history, in our history books, etc., especially about the use of kind of weapons. We've always been made to understand that in the World War I and II, in the two big wars, we've always had, more of infantry losses.
Kinetic warfare.
Kinetic warfare, hand-to-hand combat. Second World War maybe a little bit more advanced with, advanced weaponry, the naval fleets and, air forces being deployed. Never heard about chemical weapons. Have they been used ever in the world wars? Have they been tried and tested? Biochem warfare, has it been part of these two wars ever?
Absolutely. In fact, when we look back in history, there are evidences that can be found about biological and chemical warfare being deployed extensively. As I mentioned earlier, chemical warfare was very much out there for everybody to see and read, though we may not be much aware of it. But biological warfare, even when you look back in history, there are very few evidences or documentary mentions of biological weapons arms race before First World War. But around the time of Geneva Protocol, that is the first non-proliferation treaty that was signed, it was in 1925. The same time, it was mentioned in certain books that biological arms race was happening even at that time. Churchill had written in one of his books that he specifically mentioned anthrax to be used as weapons against men and horses. And this is how the arms race is going on. So if he had mentioned in so many words in his book in 1925, though there are no other documentary evidences, we can definitely say that that arms race was on since then. During the Geneva Protocol signage, it was decided that it will be focused more on chemical warfare. Of course, it was only for banning the use and deployment of chemical warfare as far as the international wars was concerned. They did not mention that manufacturing and storage of chemical weapons is banned. So that arms race, that continued afterwards.
But ma'am, what about what did these two wars have them deployed? Like, I understand that,
Yes.
you're talking about preparing them, storing them, keeping them, to try and deter your enemies or threaten your enemies. But were they used effectively in
Yes.
these two wars?
Very much. First World War saw tremendous deployment of chemical weapons, mustard gas. You must have heard about the trench wars.
Right.
And mustard gas was used, then chlorine was used, phosgene was used. And this history is ingrained in the First World War and later on in Second World War.
But that
the
is-
impact of that chemical weapons usage during First World War was so huge that it has impacted not just the European history, but the entire world's history. I'll give you just one example of this. When the First World War ended, that time there was this one young corporal who got blinded because of use of mustard gas during the First World War.
Okay.
Defeated, he came back to Germany, blinded, and full of vengeance.
Definitely.
Who was he? He was Adolf Hitler.
Really?
Yeah. But during the Second World War,
Adolf Hitler was blinded.
blinded. Temporarily, he recovered his vision afterwards, but because of mustard gas, he was blinded. During the Second World War, with the vengeance of that effect, Germany developed extensive chemical weapons, not just chemical weapons, even nerve agents. The Western allies, they were unaware of this development. They were not very sure about the level of development of German chemical program. But Adolf Hitler was very much decided, he had decided that I'm going to have cutting edge technology as far as chemical weapons are concerned. But when the time of deployment came, you must have heard about Normandy War, right? D-Day,
Definitely.
right?
Yes.
Dunkirk, you must have
Yeah,
seen,
yes, Dunkirk,
right?
yes.
So on the D-Day, his colleagues, they were coaxing him to Hitler to deploy nerve agents. But till the last time, he was very, very hesitant. Why? He was afraid of the similar retaliation from the allies, and he had that fear in his mind. We call it true deterrence. Fear of retaliation is true deterrence. Till the last time, he did not give consent to his colleagues to deploy chemical weapons. If Hitler had deployed nerve agents at that time, the entire world history would have been very, very different.
Absolutely. But I'm a little confused here, ma'am, because you're talking about chemical warfare and then there is biochemical warfare.
Yes.
So where does this
Yes.
add into? Like, what is biochem warfare?
When the Geneva Protocol was signed, and then later on, when Biological Weapons Convention was formed, that time the agents were distinguishable, biological agents and chemical agents. But there is crossover between
Absolutely.
the two. I'll give you an example of toxins. toxins are derived from plants or environment, basically from fungi or bacterial toxins. So basically life sciences sources. So they have biological source, but they act as chemicals. They do not multiply or they are not infectious. So say, for example, a botulinum toxin, it is derived from bacteria.
Right.
But if you deploy botulinum toxin in a particular area, then the people in that area will be affected. It won't get transmitted to neighboring areas.
So it's not human to human.
It's not human to human transmission
possible, right?
like bacteria and viruses, right? But it forms that overlap domain between the biological weapons and chemical weapons.
Okay.
And with more and more scientific developments, both these domains have almost merged. So now we cannot really distinguish between the two. So it is better for us to look at them together because there are just so many aspects of management.
I guess scientists and countries, especially military scientists, have thought of it in such a way that you use the potency of chemical warfare and biochemical warfare and make it more potent together.
Yes.
Like 1 + 1 becomes 11.
Yeah.
That kind of destruction is what's on their mind.
And when you're looking at it from preparedness point of view, it's better if you look at the entire landscape together rather than in isolation, everybody working in their own silos.
Right.
So that is why we use the term as biochemical weapons and not distinguish between the two. Otherwise, some of them fall within the cracks of that border, So
Right.
It is better to consider them together. I'll give you another example of this Second World War. During the Second World War, the chemical warfare, so to say, was not that extensive as far as actual deployment was concerned. But preparedness, every side was very, very well prepared. And there was fear of somebody starting the war, chemical war. Kinetic war was anyway going on. And during that time, the Americans had huge stockpiles of arsenals containing chemical weapons like mustard gas. There was this one particular warship, which was parked in a port called Bari in Italy. And it was carrying huge compilation of chemical arsenals. The American mustard gas was very notorious because it was very unstable. It had tremendous impurities. And the people who were taking care of those arsenals, till it was deployed, if at all, to take care of those because there used to be gas formation and the arsenal may explode, So they used to be required to release that gas, look at the leakages and things like that. But in a warlike situation, this becomes very challenging. This USS John Harvey was parked in a port called Bari in Italy. And during the same time, the Germans were doing their air raids.
Yeah.
And there was another ship close to USS John Harvey. It was carrying petroleum products. It got hit. It exploded. It affected USS John Harvey also. And the chemical weapons started exploding there.
Really?
Yeah.
But how come we have not read about all this in history? Is this have they brushed this under the carpet? Because I've never heard about this.
It's not them, it's us. We don't go and look for this history, And these are the kind of threats which could have actually exploded the chemical warfare again in Second World War.
Right, because this is like the way you've described it, this is a ship carrying death.
Yeah.
And there, you have a situation where it's been bombed, and it's exploded.
Yeah. And the Allied had to then very reluctantly later on accept that it was an accident so that the chemical warfare is not started by the Germans. So this is how the entire Second World War was getting played out as far as chemical weapons was concerned. On the biological side, that time when the Geneva Protocol was signed, this is a paradox of chemical and biological disarmament and non-proliferation treaties. These treaties are supposed to bring peace, right? But unfortunately, every time there is such convention that is formed,
or an amendment to a previous treaty,
it actually sparks the arms race. What happened during the Geneva Protocol? After the Geneva Protocol was signed, that time this Japanese Imperial Army's Shiroishi, he was major at that time, he was traveling in Europe. So when in 1925 Geneva Protocol was signed, that time this Major Shiroishi of Japanese Imperial Army, he was traveling in Europe and looking at different weapon programs, biological and chemical weapons programs. By the way, this Major Shiroishi was military surgeon and very ambitious person. He wanted to develop the bioweapons programs and chemical weapons programs for Japanese Imperial Army. And when he was touring Europe, he realized that all these countries are developing biological and chemical weapons on one side and signing this Geneva Protocol on the other.
Right.
Then he said, these are smart people. I have to do something about it. Came back to Japan, convinced his superiors and the government and the emperor at that time that we have to have very offensive bioweapons program. And that is how the Japanese Imperial Army's largest and massive bioweapons program started. The Japanese are known to be technologically very savvy. They used these technologies in the development of biochemical weapons, especially the biological weapons programs. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to infect an individual, you have to either create an aerosol out of a bacteria or a virus, or you have to inject it to an individual, right? How do you inject it? Japanese came up with these fantastic innovations of, we call it six-legged weapons. These are insect weapons that they developed. Say,
oh my
for
God,
example,
insect warfare.
Insect
Literally,
warfare.
I can't believe this.
So they're using insects as mediums to transfer it to the respective engineer.
As the delivery mechanism.
As a delivery mechanism. Primary delivery mechanism, secondary delivery mechanism, they rather modified their Uji bombs, Uji type 50 bombs to carry those insects. Which insects were they?
Sorry, you mean to say, just to interrupt, the bombs were carrying the insects?
Yes. So which insects were used? Fleas, mosquitoes, ticks. These are the kind of insects they were used for injecting those agents to individuals. If you have seen fleas, how difficult they are to even catch, right? They developed technologies to cultivate these fleas in large numbers, contain them, and feed them on infected rats, say with plague, and then weaponize it with using such Uji-like bombs.
For mass
destruction.
Mass destruction. Yes.
It's so
and
scary.
These Uji bombs, they used to carry, say, for example, 30,000 fleas, infected fleas, and a rat for in-flight meal till they are deployed.
Oh, the fleas had an in-flight meal.
Yeah.
Wow.
So these are the kind of innovations which were very, very new at that time.
Yeah.
Right. So this is the kind of development they had done. But what was worse was, while doing these weapon developments, they needed lab animals, right? They used the Chinese civilians and some Russian civilians and even some Western POWs, prisoners of war, as their experimental lab animals.
So you mean to say that the Japanese Imperial Army, after developing these kind of programs of biochem warfare or biochem destructive weapons, they used humans from China, Russia, etc. as their guinea pigs to test these weapons on?
Yes.
My question here is, coming back to the Geneva Convention of 1925, which you mentioned. As I understand from this, that he started doing this after the Geneva Convention was born. So you mean to say that the Geneva Convention was not a deterrent to manufacture and keep, but it was only a deterrent to use?
Deployment, yes.
But then he still used it?
Yes. He was conducting experiments on these people because they had, the Japanese Imperial Army had this facility in China, in Pingfan, where they were conducting all these experiments. And while conducting these experiments, how do you develop these weapons effectively? Then to create those parameters of effectiveness, they used to conduct the clinical studies on humans. When you have human clinical studies, then you know actually the weapon is effective. For that, the ways which developed, which they were really heinous. They conducted trials on all sorts of civilians. They conducted vivisection. A vivisection is dissecting a human when he is alive and without any anesthetic. You can imagine children, women, old people, anybody and everybody getting dissected like that in the name of research of bioweapon development. It was completely heinous crime, and it is designated as war crime. And with these technologies and developments, they collected very precious clinical data. You would ask, why there is no Nuremberg trial for Japan.
Yeah, I mean,
Right?
there should be one. I mean, if the Germans have been made to pay for and apologize publicly to the world, I'm surprised how come we don't know much about the atrocities created by the Japanese, and why are they not put to trial? What is your view on that?
Can you guess
Mm,
why it was pushed under the carpet? Such heinous crimes.
Maybe because everyone wanted to do it?
No. It was human clinical data. It was very precious. The technology designs, the weapon designs, the missiles they were used, everything was very, very precious.
So they
So how do you
wanted,
let it
everybody
go?
wanted that tech.
Yes. Everybody.
That's what I mentioned. Everyone wanted to do it at some
So-
time or the other.
So the so-called, the Western world, they're very happy to lecture, especially the global South, on ethics and morality.
Correct.
That ethics and morality was pushed under the carpet and a deal was made.
And the tech was...
Yes. The person who was in charge, Shiro Ishii, he was very shrewd person. He negotiated very shrewdly with the American and British front for exchange of this tech with them for complete pardon for his war crimes. His and all the senior scientists of Japanese Imperial Army.
Wow. And is this documented anywhere?
Yes, it is part of documents.
But it's been brushed under the
Yes.
under the carpet.
The Russians, of course, they smelled this. They said, we also want our share. Till that time, their citizens were also part of the, so to say, lab experiments of Japanese Imperial Army. So they had already constituted one war crime tribunal as such, called Khabarovsk trials, Khabarovsk war crime trials. Khabarovsk war crime trials. And those trials were conducted by the Russians. But by that time, they realized that this data is very precious and we also want some because the Americans are getting it. So they diluted those trials. They also negotiated. They also got some part of...
So everyone got a pie of the share of the tech and the weaponry that, he had developed.
Yeah. And all the ethics and morals were pushed aside conveniently. The Westerners love to preach us on that. But when it comes to business, when it comes to military superiority and geopolitical advantage, the ethics and morality are discounted very conveniently. The Second World War ended with the dropping of atomic bomb on Hiroshima, right? Called the Fat Boy.
right.
And that is how it actually ended.
Right. So here I would like to interject and ask a question that why was Hiroshima, Nagasaki bombed and not Tokyo?
Actually, I answered you a part of it earlier.
I think I know the answer, but please.
Yeah. So basically, the Americans and the British, they wanted to trade it with the Japanese Imperial Army for the very precious human clinical data. And they wanted to develop their own weapon programs. So they needed the help of Japanese scientists and Japanese government also. So that is one of the reasons, probably, it was Hiroshima and later Nagasaki as just a nuclear deterrence to any future biochemical weapon development by either Japan or anybody else.
So you mean to say that all the scientists and all the intel that was responsible for developing this kind of weaponry, biochemical weaponry, and then studying and having that human clinical data was all in Tokyo. And that is why Tokyo was spared and another city was bombed.
And Tokyo,
Am I right?
Tokyo was actually the capital,
headquarters,
right?
yes.
Headquarters.
I understand that, but that's the primary
Decision
reason
makers
there.
were in Tokyo.
Right. All the intel and all the IP was there.
So, ma'am, after listening to all this, I'm very confused as to why haven't we been taught about this in our own history? It has not even been mentioned anywhere. Is it that India was never part of such things, or what is it? Can you please enlighten me?
Sure. Actually, our history books, they always talk about First World War and Second World War, how it happened, why it happened. But they never really mention about chemical and biological warfare. I don't know, maybe it is because of the sanitized history that we are fed. But that is one of the reasons why we have not heard much about this part of warfare.
Has there been any chemical biochem warfare attack or any deployment in India against us ever in these wars?
Not during these wars, but as I mentioned in the beginning itself, the objective of this kind of warfare is degrading adversaries, right? So when you say degrading adversaries, it may or may not be part of the actual warfare as such. there are different ways of this warfare. So India experienced its own set of warfare and terrorism.
You mean biochem terrorism?
Yes.
Really?
Yes. When we talk about bioterrorism, in fact, India was the place where the first documented case of bioterrorism was recorded.
Are you serious?
Yes. Have you heard about it?
No.
No.
Never.
In 1933, it was pre-independence India, and one young chap of about 22 years, he was killed by his own half-brother. Amarendra Pandey, this young chap, was the scion of a large estate in Bengal that time. His half-brother, of course, wanted to acquire the whole thing. But how do you do it clandestinely? This brilliant man, so-called brilliant man, what he did was, he hired services of a poor doctor friend. He sent him to Hafkin Institute, Mumbai, to study plague. That was the given reason that he will study plague, to find some treatments for plague. But ulterior motive of that was to smuggle out plague bacteria.
Wow.
And he smuggled out those plague pathogens, took it to Calcutta, weaponized it with the help of syringe. And this young chap, Amarendra, when he was traveling to some place in railways, and he was on Howrah station, very busy Howrah station, he was stabbed with that umbrella weapon with plague.
My God.
And he traveled for 3 days. During that time, he got fever, he was hospitalized, and the doctors were clueless. Where he was hospitalized was actually a British military hospital. And the military doctors, they became suspicious because during that time, around that area, there was not a single case of plague. They did the forensic investigation and they found out, and of course, the techniques that they used to interrogate these people, and found out that this is how the entire sequence happened, and this is how he was assassinated using a biological weapon.
Wow.
So if you have seen the movie Razi, you see the stabbing with umbrella. Umbrella weapon is, the history goes back to Georgy Markov. If you have heard of Georgy Markov, it was in 1977 that a Bulgarian dissident, he was staying in London at that time, and when he was traveling on Waterloo Bridge, somebody came from side and stabbed him with an umbrella weapon, and the fellow, he died later on. It was suspected that it was the pellet contained ricin in it, but it was never conclusively proven. But this is considered to be actually the first umbrella weapon in the history. But actual recorded and documented history is in 1933 in India.
So, ma'am, I understand while this incident is very shocking that in 1933, this was a brother doing it to his half-brother. But my larger question here is twofold. One is that has there been any documented attack on India from a foreign invader or from somebody who is not from India, like, our enemy, where they've used a biochem weapon on us, A, and B, today, in today's day and age, how well prepared are we to fend off such attacks from our enemies in terms of biochemical weaponry?
Just the way we talked about Unit 731, experimentation of biological weapons, I'll give you one case of India. There are multiple cases. I'll just mention one because, as I mentioned earlier, that there are such many cases. And if we talk about each one, the time wouldn't be sufficient.
Understood.
So I will talk about only one case. It was, you must have heard about Dr. Salim Ali, the famous ornithologist,
right?
Bird expert.
Yeah.
In early 40s and 50s, he was a very passionate scientist. We all know that. He was very passionate about the bird banding project of migratory birds who were migrating across India and how the migratory patterns are occurring. But during that time, we were just a new nation with very different priorities. There was no research funding for this kind of research. So he was seeking funding from wherever he could. He got that funding, he started that work. But later on, this entire research became very, very controversial because of his partner. His partner was a Yale professor, Yale University professor, Dr. Ripley. Dr. Ripley was just like Dr. Salim Ali. He was also an ornithologist, well-known ornithologist. It's just that he had very different kind of work history before he became the ornithologist. He was heading the South Asia department of OSS. OSS is the parent organization of CIA.
Really?
So that became suddenly questionable. And where did he get, rather both of them got funding from, was the United States Army.
Hmm.
The entire project was funded by United States Army. Why would they do that?
They looked at probably turning his research into developing a weapon of mass destruction using biochem.
Biological weapons. And this entire thing became very, very controversial in India when a brilliant nuclear scientist turned journalist, investigative journalist of PTI, Dr. Jayaraman, he did investigative journalism for this project. He came up with all the details in addition to many such cases and submitted to the government of India. And there was huge uproar in 1974, 75, 75, 76. And during that time, the government formed one Parliament Accounts Commission, and they did the investigation. They spoke to people and different departments, and everybody was shocked. In fact, Indian Parliament was completely rocking with this subject in 1975. We are talking about 50 years ago.
So you mean to say that the CIA was and the US military was secretly partnering with somebody in India and developing these kind of weapons in India, as you know, right under our noses?
It was not a weapon as such, but
The
understanding
intention was to try
of that
and
weapon
the intention
development.
was obviously to try and
Yes.
develop a weapon in the long
And
run.
this was part of a much larger project. This was not done just in India.
Of course.
It was in entire South Asia Pacific region. This was called as Project Pacific by the United States. And there was this NGO working for this project. And this entire group was working for the migratory pattern of migratory birds. Why this is important is this set of migratory birds, they carry ticks and they carry certain viruses from one place to another. And whether that can be used as
Or delivery.
deployment.
Yeah,
This is like their
so-
way of doing it logistically to.
Yes. And it was suspected that this knowledge was deployed during the Korean War by the
Right.
Americans.
Right.
Right. So this is the kind of experimentation that we have already experienced. And it was 50 years ago. For next so many years, nothing really was done.
I admire the imagination and the techniques that they have come to, where they were looking at migratory birds to carry these and be used as a deployer of these weapons of mass destruction. It's amazing to listen to that. But again, my question, ma'am, to you is that right now in India, how prepared are we to fend off such attacks? Because like you are mentioning, there are so many ways in which these delivery mechanisms can work. So how prepared are we as a nation to fend ourselves off from these kind of attacks?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, for this was happening almost 5 decades ago.
Correct.
There was not much of an action for so many years. But with this government, we have seen that during COVID-19, there was very upfront and very innovative way of developing countermeasures and taking care of the situation and how do you handle that pandemic. Very innovative ways were developed. At one point, we were importing 100% all the PPE kits. By the end of the pandemic, or even within a few months or a year, we were already exporting PPE kits. So the entire country contributed to the preparedness at that time. And this administration is taking this very, very seriously. They have been developing mechanisms and how do you prepare a pandemic preparedness plan and how do you execute those? Because as you know, this entire landscape is very, very broad. There are just so many stakeholders in this landscape.
Right.
Whether you look at human health or plant health or animal health and all the stakeholders involved, there are just so many people, the central government, the state government, the municipal corporations, anybody and everybody, all citizens, everybody is involved. So it's not just us. it's all the nations all across the world.
And life across everywhere.
Yeah, and everybody finds it very challenging when we talk about biochemical preparedness as such. Because unlike all other threat landscape, this landscape is very broad. But this administration is taking everything very, very seriously and going forward and doing all these preparedness plans. But of course, there are some asks that I personally have. For example, as he rightly asked, why our history books don't mention
Correct.
this, right? Our national education policy is now being implemented. It should implement these parts. When COVID was happening,
At least make us aware.
Make us aware, right? Because when COVID was happening, there was panic throughout the entire country. What is happening? Is it doomsday? If you are aware of the history, then you know that this has happened before. You can take care of itself and still
We would have
survive.
at least been mentally prepared.
Mentally prepared.
Had we known
There is
that these attacks are
optimism,
regular.
There is resilience. So to have that, you need to have that awareness. So
Right.
this is something this government can definitely do, is create awareness about this entire landscape so that optimism is maintained. You know,
I have a very cheeky question here to slide in, and please feel free to not answer it. But was COVID a bioweapon?
there are different conspiracy theories, which they were called as conspiracy theories. And there were many denials. If you remember, if you read newspapers or from social media at that time, anybody suggesting a lab leak in Wuhan, forget about weaponization and biowarfare, even lab leak in Wuhan was completely cancelled, blocked, and tarnished
And
its
vanished.
image, vanished. It was completely cancelled. No, you cannot suggest any other alternative
You can't even talk about
hypothesis.
it.
You cannot talk about it. Everybody who suggested any alternative hypothesis was labeled as a conspiracy theorist. But today, when we see that many of those so-called conspiracy theories are coming true, and even the US administration is accepting now that probably there was a lab leak in Wuhan. So forget about warfare. Even such basic acceptance was not there that it was leaked in Wuhan. Whether it was accidental leak or intentional, वो तो बात की बात है. But even
We may never know that.
we may never know that, because it is very difficult to give the credibility or give the credit to that particular source unless you investigate it properly. And it becomes very challenging to decide the source, whether it is this source, that this is how it started. For that, you need to do a proper forensic investigation, which is not possible at this point of time after 3 years, 4 years. So it becomes very murky. And why this awareness is important right now is because we talked about a lot of history. But as we mentioned earlier, a lot of scientific development has been happening all these years. All the emerging technologies, all the convergent emerging technology innovations, they are of course disrupting this threat landscape like anything. Whether you talk about AI, synthetic biology, or computing, anything and everything, CRISPR, genetic engineering, there are just so many things happening right now, robotics.
There's so many strains of all this.
These things are coming together and developing very innovative technologies. So the threat landscape is completely exploding at its seams. So it's very important for us to start from the history and come to...
And first be aware at least.
First be aware and come to terms with what is happening today.
So, ma'am, one thing I would love for you to shed some light on out of all these terms that you have just used is what exactly is synthetic biology, and what are the roles of such emerging technologies such as AI in the role of this arms race?
Sure. For synthetic biology, I'll give you one example. If you want to go to a party and take a cake with you, what would you do is order a cake or use a box.
Yeah.
Right? Make your own cake. Or if you're really good at baking, what you would do is order ingredients, make your own cake, and take it along with you.
Yeah.
So synthetic biology is that, right?
Okay.
If you want an organism, you get some sample from somebody. If not, then you get the genetic code of that.
Right.
And get it designed yourself. Or what if you are far more equipped and far more acclaimed scientist in synthetic biology, what would you do is there are genetic codes available which tell you that this particular bacteria or virus has this particular code. I will give you one example. Just like for computer sciences, you have binary code of zeros and ones.
Yeah.
For bacteria and viruses, or for any genetic material, you have genetic code made of ATGC, right? So these two are interconvertible.
Okay.
The genetic information can be stored in a computer language and can be utilized by the scientists who want to do synthetic biology. They can order the subunits of ATGC, get hold of those, and construct their own agents. Either they are fragments of DNA or they are subunits, and they use this to prepare and bake their own cake. That is synthetic biology. If you've heard about CRISPR or genetic engineering, it is like Swiss knife. You can cut and edit the existing DNA.
As per your
requirement. If you want to insert some small part from something else, you can just edit it, cut it, and ligate it and use it as modified or genetically engineered genome. So that is what synthetic biology is. And this, another question you asked about emerging technologies, I will give you another example of dual-use research of concern. We call it only dual use is anything that has dual use. But when we talk about such technologies which have military applications, they are denoted as dual-use research of concern. So I will give you example of computer-aided drug design. What is it? Is you use computer technologies and computing to design your own drug on the computer based on the structure of that particular disease, whether it is the cellular structure or the pathogen. Depending on that, it is custom-made drug for that particular. And this has been done for many years now to design newer drugs. Some scientists based in US, they were worried about misuse of this technology. So they said, let us change some parameter and see if this system can give out some chemical weapons or some new biological weapons. If somebody wants to misuse this technology, can they do that? Let's give it a try. And they did it. And they found out that within 1 hour, this CADD model, computer-aided drug design model, gave out 600 completely new chemical weapons.
Really?
Yes. The structures were available. You know how to synthesize.
Sometimes the human mind itself is so scary.
Absolutely.
I think it's the biggest destructive weapon.
Absolutely. How you use it.
Yeah.
संस्कृत में एक बहुत अच्छा कपलेट है, rather saying है, मनएव मनुष्याणाम कारणम बंध मोक्षयोः. आपका मन ही आपका बंधन भी करने का ये है, और नहीं तो आपका मोक्ष भी उसी में है.
बिल्कुल.
So how you use it, that's very important.
But is there, ma'am, any regulatory body in the world that is discussing? Is there anything called, like you have, for the internet, you have certain norms, you have cybersecurity. Is there any cyber biosecurity? Is there any such protocol being followed? Is there any body controlling this, trying to stem the arms race? Because I think the way you're talking about, people have gone crazy trying to develop these kind of things as weapons of mass destruction, and it's so scary. So is there anything that is deterring these people?
Sure. There are two parts to your question. One part is such global conventions or regulatory bodies which can stop or at least control this arms race. So as I mentioned earlier about Geneva Protocol of 1925, similarly there was Biological Weapons Convention that was signed in 1975 and Chemical Weapons Convention which was signed later on. And these two conventions were specifically meant for chemical weapons and biological weapons deterrence. But there are differences in both these conventions because the Chemical Weapons Convention is far more structured and far more effective convention because it has a executing authority called OPCW, it is Organization of Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and it has a proper structure to execution. And it has verification protocols. If some country is suspected to have stockpiles of chemical weapons, then the international bodies, OPCW, can go and verify their stockpiles. Similarly,
They've been given the authority.
they've
And who
been-
gives them this authority?
this
It's the UN
CWC is under UN, and
Okay.
CWC gives them that authority.
Okay.
But for Biological Weapons Convention, there is no such verification protocol. There is no such executing authority. So in a way, that is a orphan convention, we can call. There are so large gaps in that convention that a train can pass through that.
Really?
So these are the kind of conventions that we already have.
So it's not
To
a
a
deterrent.
To a certain extent, they are deterrent, but to the other, they are not.
Ineffective.
And when we talk about emerging technologies, they are incapable of handling these new challenges. You mentioned about cyber biosecurity. I'll talk a little bit about cyber biosecurity, what exactly it is. As I mentioned earlier, that the biological sciences knowledge and computer science, they can talk to each other, right? So that is where the threat lies. You must have heard about hacking of data of large hospitals.
Yes, very much.
Right? That is one part of cyber biosecurity threat. The other cyber security threat is with devices. You must have heard about Vice President Dick Cheney. He had a pacemaker, and around 2006, there was a threat to his life via his pacemaker. What a pacemaker does is you don't have to open the pacemaker, open the heart and readjust its parameters.
Correct.
So it has some remote access. So if you want to change some parameters, you can remotely make those changes. But the same facility is utilized for hacking that pacemaker, and you can assassinate an individual.
Really? This is like a remote assassination.
Yes. So this threat was felt by the American administration at that time. And later on, one ethical hacker, he demonstrated almost a hall full of delegates, if they have
That the process
pacemakers, then with one command,
They can eliminate all of them.
yeah, he can send an electrical shock of 400 volts to all of them at one go. This is a cyber biosecurity
which I would also tend to then go into this, where this could be also like a chip introduced in the brain could also be.
Yes.
Am I going in the right direction?
Absolutely. Certain neurological conditions, they limit the mobility of an individual.
Right.
So such chips are implanted in the brain, and the brain-machine interface helps that person to have that mobility.
But it can also be misused to.
It can also be misused
to destroy that person.
So
I'm just guessing that if it's a head of state, let's say, from a big country going to another country for a neurological procedure, and somebody wants to, this is like an Inception style movie where, you can
Absolutely.
put that chip in that person's brain and control his mind.
You have very creative brain, so you have come up with this fantastic.
No, I'm just wondering, because the way you're talking about this, the direction that it's culminating into, that how scary it is, that there is a good side to it, but then there is so much evil that can be done by using these kind of things, which is very, very scary right now. I'm actually scared right now.
Okay. So, ma'am, there's a quote in this very popular book called Homo Sapiens, and the quote says that humans have the ability to coexist and cooperate with each other. That's why they survive. But after listening to you, I'm worried, are we on the path to extinction? Is that a possibility now? And what will World War III look like?
World War III. I'll come back to your question.
Okay.
But when we talk about human extinction, we should not be afraid of this threat, so to say, because scientific developments and weaponization is not happening for the first time. It has been happening for a very, very long time. Though we are facing the Cold War 2.0, as we mentioned earlier, between the United States and China today,
right,
because of this disruptive way of weapon development, especially in neurology. Did I mention about neuro warfare? I don't think so.
You touched upon it, basically.
I did.
Slightly.
So the neuro warfare is the next, so to say, front of warfare and arms race that is staring at us. The World War III is, we are worried that it may have a big portion of cognitive weapons. So what are these cognitive weapons? Cognitive weapons is basically to kill the ability or urge of a soldier to fight. So
or to even think.
Or sleep weapons. So basically, if it is part of the kinetic warfare and kinetic warfare and non-kinetic warfare goes hand in hand. Imagine a scenario in a war front if an adversary states it releases such cognitive weapons first and then attacks that war front.
You're sitting ducks.
You're sitting ducks. And once one territory is acquired, it is very difficult to take it back.
Absolutely.
So this is the kind of threat landscape it is evolving right now. But again, as I said, technological developments are not happening for the first time. Our civilization has seen for it for many generations. If you have heard about Sagar Manthan, it was also the similar situation,
Just want to quickly
right?
jump in here. You're talking about that. You're talking about ancient India,
Ancient
where
India.
we have had access to these kind of tech and weaponry. Are you talking about celestial weapons, or are you going in that direction?
We have heard about Brahmastra and so many
Absolutely.
astras,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
People want to call them mythological. There is no evidence typically. But when we look at it, even forget about the warfare part, even if from philosophical point of view, if we look at that, what was Sagar Manthan? It was similar use of emerging technologies and dual use research of concern of those times. That is how after the Sagar Manthan, what we got out of it was Amrit and Halahal, right? So to handle both, you need to have that vivek, that sadsada viveka buddhi to handle that properly.
Right.
And that is our cultural civilization that gives us that guidance to handle this kind of situations and how do you take it forward from this point and how you become, so to say, a leader in this
So you're talking about the
situation.
ethics and morality in terms of, when you have access to this kind of weaponry, and like you're saying, India has had this since thousands of years,
Yeah.
but we have never misused it.
Yeah.
Is what you're trying to get at. And I think that I would take this whole podcast in a manner to learn that although we have had this for so many years, we're still the only civilization that's thrived and is still thriving, probably because we've never attacked anyone, despite having all this kind of tech and know-how. And I think that sets the tone for us on the world stage to try and be a leader in terms, or a monitor, in terms of making sure that everyone involved in this arms race in whatever capacity that they may be, to try and be ethical and moral about it, because at the end of it, it's going to lead to something, which is going to be so disastrous where, we will probably cross the point of no return and, we won't be able to come back to normalcy. We've seen it with the pandemic recently, although there are conspiracy theories that this could be a big bioweapon, it could be a human culling, it could be the Holocaust, etc., a slow Holocaust. It is worrying, but having heard you talk about the last point that you mentioned, where we have the morality and the buddhi, the vivek buddhi to try and handle these things, I think, now I feel a little bit better after listening to that part that, we've been in this for a long time and we've managed ourselves very well. So having said that, I would like to thank you for being on our show. And I think each of the topics that you've spoken about, each of the buzzwords that you've used, or each of the key phrases you've used itself can become a larger podcast in the future. And I hope that, in the future, you do come on our show regularly and talk about these things, because I think this is very intriguing. And the first step that this podcast has done is to create awareness, because unless we're aware that we've dealt with these kind of pandemics in the past, we won't have that mental strength to deal with it in the future. So I think this is a great start, and I think we should be building on this kind of a series of podcasts on bioweapons, biosecurity, cyber biosecurity. All these things need to be spoken about in more depth in the future. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.